This lesson we're going to look at absolute values. And one thing with absolute values that you'll see is something as follows. You're going to see something like, let's say 7 in these just straight lines right around it. So they're almost kind of like brackets, but they represent absolute values, right? So we might have something like that. We might have something like that. Right? So they're not represented like brackets, but we're going to kind of look at them like they're brackets, but they're considered absolute values. And absolute values, whatever is considered inside these straight line brackets, so to speak, right, is always going to represent a positive value. It's going to represent what we call an absolute value of that number. When looking at absolute values, really what we're looking at is the idea of a number and how far is that number from the 0 point on a number line, right? So if I had something like the absolute value of 4, and that's how it's read, the absolute value of 4, right? So what we're looking at is how far from 0, right? How far from 0 is positive 4, right? And that distance is really 4, right? 4 units. So the absolute value of 4 is 4. It's really a positive value. Now, if we looked at something like the absolute value, right? So the absolute value of a negative 4, right? So we're going to find negative 4 here on the number line. And how far is 0 to 4, or how far are we from the 0 point on a number line to 4? Well, in fact, we are also 4 units, but going in the opposite direction. But it's still considered 4 unit distance. The absolute value, right, is really the distance, right? Pretty much the distance of a number from 0. So in other words, right, how far is it? And it's really 4 units for negative 4. It is 4 units positive for a positive 4. So it doesn't really matter. All we know is that positive values will remain positive. So the absolute value of a positive number is always a positive number. The absolute value of a negative number is equal to a positive. So the absolute value of negative 4 is 4. So in other words, really, we are always looking at anything that is inside these line brackets as being a positive value. Let's look at a couple of examples here. So we've got 5 and then the absolute value of 1 minus 7. So really, what we've got here is absolute, right? So we read this as the absolute value of 1 minus 7. So what is the absolute value of 1 minus 7 is going to be a negative 6. So this is what the next line is going to look like. We still have the absolute value symbol, but we've got now a negative 6 in it. And as we said, if there is a negative value inside these absolute symbols, right, then we are looking at a positive value. So in other words, this negative 6 is going to become a positive 6. But because this number here, this 5, is followed by the absolute, really what this means is we're actually going to be multiplying the value of 5 multiplied by whatever the absolute value of this is. So we can almost treat this as if they were brackets now, but we've already made the conversion of this negative 6 value to a positive 6, because as we said, absolute values make everything inside the absolute value positive, right, once we've completed the operation, right? And outside we've got a 5. So now 5 multiplied by 6 will give me a value of 30. But now not always are, just because you see an absolute value, are you going to have a positive value, right? Sometimes you can have a negative value, but there are reasons for why they're negative, and you'll see with this next example. So this next example says to simplify negative 4 and the absolute value of 5 minus 8. So what we're going to do is we are going to handle this absolute value, right? So we've got negative 4, and the absolute value of 5 minus 8 is going to give me negative 3. So this negative 3 here is inside the absolute values. So the negative 3 is going to become a positive 3. Remember, as we said, whatever's inside the bracket, or sorry, inside the absolute value symbol is going to be a positive value, or become a positive value. And outside we have this negative 4. So in other words, now we've got negative 4 and the absolute of negative 3, which became 3. At this point here, because we've converted the inside into a positive value, inside the absolute values into a positive value, we can now technically replace these with regular typical brackets. And now we know the function is a negative 4 multiplied by 3, which will give me a value of negative 12. So here is where we can actually get a negative value. But inside this absolute, yeah, the absolute became a positive value. But it was a term outside of the absolute values that was negative that created this negative answer. Let's look at another example here. So simplify the absolute value of negative 7 added with the absolute value of negative 3. So the absolute value of negative 7 is positive 7. Right? We're going to add it to the absolute value of negative 3, which is positive 3. So once we've made the conversion from the negative value to a positive, we can now replace, right, these absolute values with brackets, let's say. And we don't need the brackets anymore because now it's just a typical 7 plus 3 answer, which will give me a value of 10. Simplify the following. Now, what you got to be careful with is how to read this, right? People will look at it and go and think it's a question that'll say 7 minus 3 minus 5 minus 6. No. In fact, I'm going to show you really what this means. This really means 7 is multiplied by the absolute value of negative 3, and this negative 5 here, right, is going to be multiplied by the absolute value of negative 6. So let's rewrite this. So we've got 7, and the absolute value of negative 3 is going to become positive 3. Subtracted by 5. This negative 5 is not inside absolute values. The absolute values are really surrounding the 6 and surrounding the negative 3. So the absolute value of negative 6 is going to become positive 6. So now, as we said, we can remove absolute values once we've made the conversion from our negative to a positive value. We can now replace them with round brackets. So 7 brackets 3 minus 5 and brackets 6. So now if we look at it, we've got 7 multiplied by 3, right, which will give me 21. Negative 5 multiplied by 6 is going to give me a negative 30. So 21 and the negative 30, it becomes 21 minus 30, which will give me a value of negative 9. So as we said, right, we can still have a negative value, but remember, we don't have absolute values around the entire answer. Our absolute values here in this question, right, were just here with this negative 3, with this negative 6. So once we were able to convert those absolute values into our positive, or answer, right, then we no longer need the absolute values, and we can replace them with brackets. Now, all the examples we've looked at have all had the absolute values that are negative. Now, what happens if I put an absolute value? We looked at it at the very beginning, if you remember, but I'm going to just redo it here. What if I had the following, right? I had absolute values of 3 minus absolute values of 5. So in other words, because the absolute values are already positive, we no longer need the absolute value bars around our numbers, because really the absolute value of a positive number will stay positive. So the answer becomes 3 minus 5, which for this answer will become -2. So notice whatever's inside the absolute values stay positive, right? Or become positive if there are negative inside the absolute value bars.